Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Rust on Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95, broadcasting at 9:50 a.m. and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, the right station for talk. I am here in the studio today with Justin. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you. Always happy to be on the show.
And Eddie Hager. Welcome, Eddie.
Thank you. Glad to be back again.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming in. This is a big show today, folks. We're going to be talking about data centers. And I want to preface that a little bit. So, folks, do any of you all remember there was a Tom Cruise movie back in 2004 called War of the Worlds? And in that movie, aliens sent in from outer space these spaceships, and using electricity, using lightning, they struck these pods into Earth's crust, and out of the Earth came these what were called tripods to go after humans. I can think of no more perfect analogy than what these data centers are doing to Indiana. It is exactly the same. They are both using, ironically, electricity to suck the life out of our state. In the case of that movie, it was about going after human life directly because the aliens needed our blood to replenish their life form, wherever that was. Instead, today's data centers, and I'm not saying this lightly, I'm not saying this jokingly, folks, these data centers are going after your way of life. It is all about control. It is all about transfer of wealth. It is all about transfer of the taxpayers of Indiana, our electricity, our water, to go to these tech billionaires and trillionaires to control what happens in the future, to control your jobs, to decide what jobs will be available to us in the future. So in a little bit of background on this, I'm going to read this from Indianapolis Monthly, an article by Eve Batey, B-A-T-E-Y, published February 12th, 2026. It says, "Getting to the bottom of the data center boom. It seems like every tech company wants a piece of Indiana these days, with the giants from Silicon Valley buying up land to construct buildings packed with IT equipment. Indiana is an appealing target for big tech. Why is that? It says, number one, land is far cheaper in places like Indiana than it is where most of these companies are based. And it says, and many of these tracts that these corporations purchase are unused or blighted. You know, I take exception to that. I do not believe any piece of Indiana land is blighted. What they're saying is farmland's blighted. I think farmland's beautiful. I would much rather see corn being grown in a field somewhere than a data center there."
Amen.
Absolutely. We have to feed America.
You know, this article goes on, and it talks about how some politicians in Indiana are now finally starting to push back on data centers. Because, folks, we have got told this all along, oh, we have to accept these data centers, that's the future. No, we don't. This is from the article again. Counselor Michael Paul Hart, who describes himself as a conservative Republican, successfully opposed Google's efforts to bring a data center to his district by comparing the tax benefits residential development would bring to the tracts sought by the tech company. Data centers employ very few people, Hart says, so we wouldn't be seeing much in the way of economic benefits. And the other issue is they are just too big to ignore. And this is, again, from the article. Data centers use a tremendous amount of energy to power the devices they house, which places a notable burden on local power companies. And in the locales that already have the data centers, that's resulted in skyrocketing electric bills for everyone. And I would add for everyone in Indiana. Once again, folks, electricity rates last year went up 17%. The year before that, they went up 9%, on average for every Hoosier across the state. Why is that? It's exactly because of these data centers.
And it seems like if the state gets their way, it's going to continue because they just keep wanting to plop more and more of them down.
Why is that? You know, what is the state getting in exchange for that?
Who knows? That was probably decided in those champagne clinks that Jim Banks and Mark Zuckerberg were having.
Why on earth Jim Banks thought it was a good idea to post a picture of himself with the champagne glass with Mark Zuckerberg in Virginia or wherever it is Jim Banks lives now? Why he did that is beyond me.
Terrible political instincts, that's for sure.
Well, they're not ashamed of who they're in bed with.
Well, and who's paying them off. You know, you always have to follow the money in life. Always, always, always. You know, I talk about that every time. You know, it's like the roundabouts. Always follow the money. A roundabout costs $2 million. 4 stop signs cost $800. If you're a politician on the take, you're going to get more from someone putting in a $2 million roundabout than you are for installing 4 stop signs. Sorry, that's how a farmer looks at it. So back on these electric rates, and this is again from this article in Indianapolis Monthly. It says, I could not get AES to promise me that rates would not go up across the grid for customers. And this is according to the Councilman Hart. And he says Duke Energy similarly refuses to give any promises on that because they know, folks, these data centers are going to use massive amounts of electricity. They already do, and it will only increase more and more. And your electricity rates will only increase more and more. The other issue is water. Most data centers use vast amounts of water to bring the temperatures down. This seems like it wouldn't be an issue in Verdant, Indiana, but in Newton County, Georgia, which has a comparable rainfall to Indiana, it tells a different story. Newton County, Georgia, not Newton County, Indiana, but Newton County, Georgia, is expected to experience a water deficit by 2030 due to an influx of data centers in the region. While data centers might differ in scale, noise, and consumption, one thing is consistent. After the work of construction is done, the fortress-like building employs only a few people, typically a janitorial or security staff. The impact on jobs is low. The number one issue is electric and water usage, of course. But it's like Ross Perot said, folks. Remember, Ross Perot, when he was talking about NAFTA back in the 1990s, he says it would be a giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico once NAFTA was enacted. And he was absolutely correct on that. These data centers are sucking up our water and our electricity. And the end goal, remember what I talked about on War of the Worlds, is to take your jobs as well. What are these data centers doing? It's not just harmless stuff like a meme where you may be on Twitter or Facebook. That's not what these data centers are really about. These data centers are about massive computing, tracking, and calculation. And the key word there is tracking with these flock cameras. It's not about speeding tickets, folks. Yep. It is about tracking where you go and what you are doing.
Surveillance State 101.
The eye in the sky.
And so folks are like, why are Indiana politicians bringing these god-awful things into our state? Folks, it's all about the money. There's a candidate in Florida running for governor, and I'm going to give a little bit of background on this. Ron DeSantis has always been very opposed to new data centers going into Florida. He has fought them tooth and nail. There's a candidate named Byron Donalds who is being pushed by the establishment to replace Ron DeSantis. Guess what? Byron Donalds was just paid $5 million by a super PAC to build AI data centers in Florida. This is from James Fishback, who is a candidate for governor in Florida. James Fishback says, as governor, I will block the construction of AI data centers that jack up our electric bills and contaminate our water. There's a data center going into Monrovia, Indiana, and the IEDC, this is from Ben Inskeep on Twitter, the IEDC has executed a 50-year sales tax exemption with Google for its 1,200 megawatt data center planned for Monrovia, Indiana. The sales tax subsidies Google receives will be kept secret, but could easily total billions of dollars over those 50 years. Only 50 jobs to be created. And I would add in, of those 50 jobs, how many of those will really be outsourced to India? How many of those will be using the H-1B visas to bring people in to replace Hoosier jobs with people from India or another country? It's not about Hoosier jobs, folks. Again, this is from Ben Inskeep. He says, Indiana's sales tax exemption will give about $34 million per year in reduced utility bills to each 1,000 megawatt AI data center. That figure does not include the benefit from no sales tax on equipment. When will Hoosier lawmakers end this wasteful handout to big tech billionaires?
Indiana opened up the door in 2019 when they passed that bill to give those tax breaks to the data centers.
For 35 and 50 years.
Yes. They didn't put in building standards and development standards for data centers. So they treat a data center as if it's a warehouse instead of it being a data center. So they don't take in noise, vibration, impact. They don't take into consideration water consumption. They don't take in noise pollution. None of that is being taken into consideration. We have 27 right now that's in the process of either being approved or being considered for the state of Indiana. And people ask, well, why did it hit us all of a sudden? There will be no development standards. There will be no building standards for data centers passed at the State House.
And what that is, Eddie, that is just like in War of the Worlds, had the Indiana Republican establishment been falling over themselves to give tax breaks to the aliens coming in and landing to take us over. It is no different. Folks, I'm all about fair play. I'm all about equal rights for everyone. What I don't like about this is why on earth are we giving Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg potentially billions of dollars of Indiana tax revenue while you folks, if you have a lawnmower repair business, for instance, you're going to be paying taxes. They're not going to give you a tax break. No. If you run a restaurant, if you run a gas station, whatever you're doing that is contributing to our economy, they are only doing it to these tech billionaires who are worth a gazillion billion dollars, and they want to do this so that they can take over more and more of our economy. Because we talk about what these data centers do. They're working on artificial intelligence to take over the jobs of most white-collar workers, and that's coming right now. One of the factors leading to, I think, a recession that we are going into now, the job numbers were just revised for all of last year for 2025 down 1 million jobs. There was 1 million fewer jobs created than what the government said. Why is that? It's because these data centers are actually starting to take white-collar jobs away.
The worker is going to be the thing of the past. They'll be eliminated through the assembly. They'll be eliminated through distribution, the moving of product through the American economy.
And the Indiana GOP establishment is pushing it through to incentivize it. That's what I understand it, folks, because you follow the money. This is from Adam Wren on Twitter. He says, from the New York Times, Amazon's biggest data center, everything is supersized for AI on a 1,200-acre cornfield in Indiana. Amazon is building one of the largest computers ever for work with artificial intelligence. And Aaron goes on, he says, my math, based on the figures in this article, is that about 92% of all the taxes that would have ordinarily been paid by this facility have been completely waived. Folks, they are getting off 92% tax-free.
Pay 8%.
So they only pay 8% of what you have to pay.
That's a tax shift.
It's a transfer from working people in Indiana to Jeff Bezos and to Mark Zuckerberg.
They had a convention of builders and developers in Chicago in September of last year. Their whole plan was to go after the small economy. So go after the towns that are 1,500 in population or less. And if you look at 19 of the applications for the 26 applications that are in play, they're all in towns of 1,500 or less.
Because they know they can go in there without opposition.
Yes.
But folks, guess what? We are fighting this now. I have billboards across the state of Indiana saying no to data centers. Yep. We're out of time for this segment. When we come back, we're going to get right back into this. This is John Rust on the Radio. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on the Radio, the John Rust Show on Freedom 95, broadcasting at 9:50 a.m. and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, the right state. So, folks, we are talking about data centers on this show today, and one of the issues that is front and center on this is water usage. So I want to dig into this a little bit, and this is from Rushy on Twitter. It says, it's been months and I'm still trying to figure out why AI data centers need fresh water, not used water, not recycled water. Why fresh water? Someone came back and immediately answered, this is why. Google's single data center in Council Bluffs, Iowa consumes 1 billion, with a B, billion gallons of fresh water in 2024. One facility, 1 year. Enough to supply every home in Iowa for 5 days. The reason they need fresh water is pure chemistry. Evaporative cooling towers work by running water over hot surfaces and letting it evaporate. 80% of the water a data center pulls literally vanishes into the atmosphere as steam. You can't recycle steam. The remaining 20% becomes concentrated mineral waste, calcium, magnesium, silica. Every cycle through the cooling loop makes the water more corrosive. After enough passes, it starts clogging pumps and eating through heat exchangers. Multi-million-dollar equipment destroyed by limescale, basically. Recycled wastewater carries even more of those minerals from the start. You could treat it, but less than 1% of U.S. water is recycled. Most cities don't even have enough separate pipes to deliver reclaimed water to industrial customers. A data center wanting to use recycled water would essentially need to build its own treatment plant on site. Meanwhile, municipal potable water costs almost nothing, so they just drink from the tap. Across all of its data centers, Google uses 8.1 billion with a B gallons of water, nearly double what it used 3 years earlier.
What's occurring in Ohio is that wastewater that comes off of those data centers is now being injected down into the lower aquifer to 1.6 billion gallons a day.
The trajectory is a real story. U.S. data center water consumption could quadruple by 2028. That's 68 billion gallons of cooling alone, more than 211 billion gallons consumed indirectly through electricity generation. 2/3 of new data centers since 2022 are being built in regions already facing water scarcity. Nobody's asking why they use fresh water. They're asking what happens to the towns sharing a water main with a facility that drinks like 50,000 people showing up overnight. And it's happening right here in Indiana. This is from Hoosier Truth. Unbelievable. Lebanon, Indiana is planning on dumping Eli Lilly and Company and Meta, aka Mark Zuckerberg, their industrial waste directly into Eagle Creek. This is from WRTV on this. Lebanon Utilities confirm it is surveying areas for a pipeline that would pump wastewater from Lebanon into Eagle Creek Reservoir, a move the Eagle Creek Advisory Committee says could have major impact on the ecosystem.
It will kill the lake.
Why are we doing that for Mark Zuckerberg?
Why are we doing it for Lebanon, Indiana?
You know, folks, U.S. data centers will consume nearly 10% of the entire U.S. power grid by 2030. That is 4 times the percentage seen in China. We need more power immediately. And I was talking to Eddie about this before the show. We're talking about how electric rates are going up. The big deal is we don't have enough supply of electricity. In Indiana, the politicians are working to close coal-powered power plants. They give lip service to coal and say, oh, coal's fine, but they're not building new coal-powered power plants, which we absolutely positively should be doing today. You don't hear anything about that. All you hear is the politicians saying, well, maybe we'll keep this plant running a little bit longer. A lot of these coal plants still have a service life of 20 years before they need rebuilt or reconditioned. And the politicians are saying, well, we're pro-coal if we let a coal plant that is already in production today stay in production. But, folks, that doesn't do anything about the new power we need today. We need more electricity produced today. And I was talking to Eddie about this before the show started, how it relates to egg prices. You know, because the key for Hoosiers is to get our electric bills down. We will not get our electricity bills down until we have a lower cost of electricity. And front and center, that means coal-powered power plants. You know, the issue, everyone says, well, wind and solar is so much cheaper. No, it's not. Remember, folks, in Kentucky, electricity on average costs 12 cents per kilowatt. In Indiana, it is 17 cents per kilowatt. Why? Because we rely much more on wind and solar than Kentucky does. You know, again, solar and wind is wonderful when the wind's blowing and the sun's shining. Or we have power brownouts in northern Indiana now when it gets hot. I know this for a fact because my family, we have a chicken farm in Newton County, Indiana, near Brook, Indiana. We get asked by the power company there to turn on our generators and run our farms ourselves with diesel generators because they do not have enough power to power the homes in the area to keep the air conditioning running when there's no wind and it's really hot outside. So we absolutely do that. You know, we do our part to make sure that folks have air conditioning because we don't want you to be uncomfortable or, you know, in a hospital, you have to have electricity. Is that really a reliable energy grid, folks, where you have to ask people in a developed country to turn off their electricity and run their own private generators so that there's enough electricity for everyone. That sounds like something that's going on in Cuba rather than in the United States. So the discussion we need to be having on these data centers is, if you're going to have a data center, they have to finance a new electricity producer to bring down rates for everyone. That would be bringing a value to a Hoosier taxpayer, to a Hoosier consumer, to a Hoosier ratepayer. Instead, today, every one of these data centers is instead asking you to help subsidize their electricity because they see Indiana, which still has comparatively lower rates than, for instance, California, but not for long, not at the rate increases we're having now. So these data centers just see Indiana as gullible rubes that they can come in like these aliens from another planet to take our natural resources for their own good. You know, it's not going to be for Hoosiers' good. For the promise of a few janitorial jobs, we are being asked to exponentially increase our electricity rates. That's wrong.
And forced to do so.
You know, we need more power immediately. We need new coal-powered plants immediately. You know, this is from WFFT Fox 55 News. Indiana leads the nation in energy consumption by AI. Isn't that an incredible statistic? According to WFFT Fox News, folks, nearly half of the electricity in Indiana is already going to data centers. Folks, that's not a figure to be proud of.
No.
That's a figure to be ashamed of. You know, it's just incredible to read this, but it's the absolute truth. WFFT Fox 55 posted this. Nearly one half of Indiana's state energy goes to these data centers. Folks, that's why your electricity is going up 17% a year. It's ridiculous. And the politicians have already given them a free pass on paying taxes. So they're, of course, here and we're stuck with them. You know, that's not right. It is not right. And folks, this is one of the reasons I don't like career politicians, because career politicians will always sell their soul to the devil for their next election. That's all they care about. They don't see anything but their next election, nothing else. So, of course, we get these data centers with ramifications that will last for 50 years in many cases now. 50 years. Your children's grandchildren will be paying taxes in Indiana to make up the difference that the Mark Zuckerberg's Meta and Amazon will not be paying in the future, but your grandkids will be paying. All for a promise for today that you're paying for in so many ways. You're paying for it in higher electricity prices. You're paying for it in lost water. You're paying for it in taxes that you're going to have to pay that these giant billionaire tech corporations are never going to pay. Once again, according to Aaron Wren, they are exempted from 92% of taxes going forward.
You know,
but you sure aren't.
And, you know, I like what you said about the politicians selling their souls, because how much you want to bet that all these politicians that voted for these data centers to get the tax breaks and all that, how much you want to bet that when their next election comes around, they're going to be talking, oh, the data centers, oh, they're bad, oh, we need to get rid of the data centers, but then you go back, look at the voting record, they all voted for these data centers.
It's guaranteed. They're all going to change their tunes over the next few years. You know, I would love nothing more for every conservative Republican in Indiana to stand up to these tech billionaires and say, no, not in our state. Unfortunately, you know, as evidenced by Jim Banks clinking a champagne glass with Mark Zuckerberg, you know what's really going on. You know, people are on the take.
Yeah, they're not ashamed of it.
They're proud of it.
Yep.
That's the sad part. You know, what a repulsive photo that was. And he's proud of it. You know, that is selling out Hoosiers. I think that's one of the reasons he left Indiana and moved to Virginia, because he couldn't look Hoosiers in the eye for what he's doing to our state. You know, not only just with Mark Zuckerberg, but with the trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that both Jim Banks and Todd Young voted for. We don't have conservative Republicans in our state. You know, this is from Michael on Twitter talking about this new $11 billion massive data center campus in St. Joseph County, Indiana. It will be primarily dedicated to training and running AI models. It will use 2.2 gigawatts of power, equivalent to the electricity needs to power roughly 1 million homes and approximately 300 million gallons of water per year.
Coming to Indiana.
It is a transformation. It is an alien transformation. It's exactly War of the Worlds, folks. That is the perfect analogy. Aliens are coming in and literally sucking Indiana dry And our Indiana politicians are helping them do it by giving them all these tax breaks. It's incredible. Again, Ron DeSantis says no to data centers. He says they do not create jobs and they suck up all the electricity. This is from Ron himself. I don't think there's very many people that want to have a higher energy bill just so some chatbot can corrupt some 13-year-old kid online. That's not what anybody is signing up for. Well, they are in Indiana. Our politicians are signing up for it.
In a big way.
And I don't know how much this show, because I will post this on YouTube, how much it will get throttled because it's anti-data center. This is from Daniel Horowitz. He says, I've now used YouTube for the first time for about 6 weeks, and it is becoming clear that anything critical of generative AI or data centers is completely frozen. He says it's worse than the vaccine censorship that was happening. And folks, what he's talking about there, if you remember back during COVID, if you spoke up and said that you were anti-vaccine and you wanted a free choice in the matter, and you posted that on Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook, they would immediately delete that and stop you from even being able to tweet. They would put you in Facebook jail, quote unquote, for daring to have an opinion different than Mark Zuckerberg's.
Control of free speech.
So folks, we're out of time for this segment. When we come back, we're going to talk about how instructions to create AI porn have been hosted on Indiana government websites. It's incredible. This is John Rust. We will be right back. This is Rust on the Radio. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on the Radio. I'm kind of chuckling here because this next story we're going to be talking about is incredible to me, and maybe it's why all these data centers being forced on Hoosiers so they can make AI porn. Ugh. Listen to this. This is from Fox 59 by an article by Matt Christie. This was published December 2nd, 2025. Dateline Indianapolis. Indiana government websites are being used to host documents that detail how users can access AI applications and websites to create deepfake pornography. What on earth is going on with that?
It's embarrassing is what it is. Indiana government utilities being used for something.
An Indiana government website.
Exactly. Indiana government website being used for AI porn. Like, what are we doing? Indiana is a Christian conservative state, and we're doing stuff like that. That's ridiculous.
What are the uses for AI? A lot of it's silly. A lot of it is disgusting. A lot of it is to take your jobs. A lot of it may be to help in the future. There could be wonderful things from AI in the future. And I believe there is an Indiana state investigation on that right now, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we will be getting into this specific issue, folks, in a future show because it is repulsive on what happened. Well, folks, another reason these data centers are being built, it relates to Bitcoin. Guess what? The cost of electricity wasted to create one Bitcoin is $96,000. You do the math. I think that's a big part of why these data centers are being built. They don't talk about that so much. It's all these computers doing something for a product. If you want to buy Bitcoin, that's your right. Absolutely. But don't force me to buy it, and don't force me to pay higher electricity prices so that you can have Bitcoin paid for by Hoosier ratepayers. And that's what's probably happening right now.
Track it, trace it, trade it.
This is from Bloomberg. It says AI data centers are sending power bills soaring. Wholesale electricity costs as much as 267% more than it did 5 years ago in areas near data centers. That's being passed on to customers. Again, that's from Bloomberg. But we all know that in the state of Indiana. Folks, this is from Indy Reporter. Recently submitted documents show AES Indiana is planning a 1,200 megawatt substation on site. 1,200 megawatt, that is enough power for 1 million homes. There are 2.7 million homes in Indiana. This data center requires as much energy as it takes to power almost 1/3 of the homes in our state. Also, it is expected to use roughly 4 million gallons of water a day. And what this is talking about is Google has revealed itself as the developer of a 500-acre Morgan County data center that's coming.
Small communities.
Well, they're going where it's easy pickings, where they can push over these local politicians, and these politicians get dollar signs in their eyes, folks, because these data centers are being used to drive up your property taxes. You know, folks, they would rather have a data center next to you than a cornfield, because that data center, in theory, well, it's not going to be paying any taxes for a long time because it's being forgiven, but its value will cause your value, because you live next door, for your property to go up. So you're going to be paying more in property taxes. That's what these local politicians see. Anything they can do to drive up property taxes, they want to do wholeheartedly. And that is part of the equation on these data centers, 100%.
What's the population of Morgan County?
Morgan County has 71,780 people, according to the 2020 census.
And Google wants to come to that community.
Well, of course. And so those 70,000 folks are going to be paying more in property taxes because of it. And that's what the local elected politicians see. That's all they care about. You know, this is from Indie Reporter. They really want these data centers to happen, as the energy needed for artificial intelligence fuels an uptick in power demand. Large infrastructure funds have seized on the need for more data center capacity. Companies such as Meta and Oracle and Google are working on their own debt-financed data center projects. You know, and the folks is talking about BlackRock. BlackRock is now in a takeover of one of our Indiana utility companies, AES. So it's not just about your homes, it's about feeding the invasion of the data centers. And folks, you may think, well, why are my electric rates going up? Well, it's all about demand, but guess what the AES Indiana CEO's pay is?
Well, he took a $14 million bonus last year.
Justin, you want to guess what his pay is?
Too much, I'll say that.
Okay, $13 million a year. This is from an article by Jacob Stewart. For-profit natural monopolies were a mistake. Folks, he just said the key word there. It's a monopoly. If you're in a house in an AES area, you don't have the choice to get electricity anywhere else but from AES. So why on earth is that executive being paid $13 million a year for a guaranteed customer? You know, he doesn't have to do anything. You're going to need electricity no matter what.
Have been a customer for 10 years with AES. Never missed a payment, never been late. But this last October, we were sent a very long, lengthy letter that said, because you went onto the budget so you could manage your electrical cost and know what your electrical cost was per month, because you've been on that now for 24 months, you have to come off of that. In order to come off of that and come back onto a budget program, you have to pay $4,000 next month.
Good grief.
Next month. Or go back to being off of the budget, and you'll suffer the consequences by paying anywhere from a $400 to $500 swing from one month to the next.
You have to pay his $13 million a year salary, Eddie. Well, this is from Indie Reporter. Additionally, Braun's administration views data centers as a way to bring rates down, since large energy users can spread out the burden for fixed utility costs. Wait, what? That's from Indie Reporter. Folks, there was a railroad called the Chicago Rock Island Pacific, the Rock Island Railroad, that went bankrupt in 1980. And there was a famous quote back then, and it was talking about a station agent. He says, well, we lose $100 on every car we ship, but we make up for it in volume. That's exactly the sentiment behind saying, well, we're losing all this money. Data centers are causing electric rates to go up, so we'll just do more, and that will cause your rates to drop. No, it's exact opposite. They will only increase. You know, Amazon is going to be spending $50 billion on AI infrastructure. This is from Daniel Horowitz. The project will add 1.3 gigawatts of capacity across new data centers, with Amazon expected to break ground in 2026. Isn't it interesting how the AI crowd always speaks not of capabilities, outputs, and outcomes, or even in terms of computing power, but just in terms of how much energy their facilities consume or how much debt is incurred in AI spending? Imagine boasting how many gallons of fuel your car requires rather than miles per gallon, let alone horsepower. Let that roll around in your brain a little bit, and you can see that this is not about accomplishing any achievements in terms of services or capabilities. but just a real estate deal. A real estate deal that needs to be as big as possible, as fast as possible, so taxpayers have to bail out the crash. Folks, again, I'm going to read that last sentence again. So that taxpayers have to bail out the crash.
And not a single data center in Indiana has signed a decommission agreement. So when they leave, we get to clean up the pond.
After they've taken all the water and all of our electricity. This is from Ron DeSantis. Providing special treatment, a.k.a. regulatory moratoriums, tax abatements, and zoning preferences for AI companies is bad policy on its face. But it is particularly absurd when its proponents are predicting massive unemployment as a result. And he's responding to a tweet by Unusual Whales. It says AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. That is from Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei. Oh joy, so we're bringing in these data centers to give us massive unemployment in addition to higher utility rates.
I mean, higher electricity, higher water. You mentioned it's going to cause property taxes to go up, more money out of our pockets, and then we're going to be losing our jobs because of it.
We'll be called the non-working class instead of the working class of America.
100%.
Well, this is from Indie Reporter, and he's talking about a tweet by Angela Moore. It says, developer Chris King sends his out-of-town construction crew to hold signs in support of his proposed data center to fill limited seats at a planning committee meeting, while the majority of local Henry County residents who are against it are locked out. This is from Indie Reporter. Chris King is on the IEDC board, and he was trying to get a data center in. This seems like a conflict of interest.
He's actually now been approved for the Henry County development site for a data center. And his workers showed up, about 65 showed up, and they actually blocked the door. And there was only 35 people allowed inside the planning commission meeting.
Because they took up all the seats.
They took up all the seats. And then
they made it sound like, oh, this is a wonderful thing.
Yes.
Because we're going to have these jobs for 6 months while the place is being built. After that's done, all we're left with is maybe a janitorial job.
Maybe a janitorial job.
While the data center real jobs, in my opinion, go to India or are outsourced, somewhere outside the United States.
Yes, this data center will not benefit Henry County or Indiana.
Again, this is from Ron DeSantis. This is from Cryptid Politics on Twitter. It says, alpha male Ron DeSantis comes out guns a-blazing against AI and big data centers in Florida. This is from Governor DeSantis. I think it's wrong if they come to build a data center and then charge the normal customers for high electricity. We're not going to let that happen. Bravo, Ron DeSantis. Folks, we're out of time for this segment, but when we come back, we're going to dig right back into this. This is John Rust on the Radio. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on The John Rust Show on Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95, broadcasting at 9:50 a.m. and 95.9 FM on your radio dial. Folks, we're talking about data centers, and we're talking about AES. We're talking about all the utilities in the state of Indiana. And I want to get into a really fascinating report by Ben Verbanek out of Terre Haute. He says, we all see our electricity prices rising, but did you know that investor-owned utilities can use your rate dollars that you're paying for to lobby the Indiana State House for more rate increases? Your own dollars are being used against you. That's from Ben Verbanek. Amen, absolutely. Folks, in addition to the state legislature allowing utilities to use your rate dollars, listen to this, Indiana just used their trifecta supermajority in the House to pass a bill banning local rezoning hearings for data centers and green energy products when used to transform farmland. The Indiana House passed HB 1333 on February 2nd, 2026. It allows data centers, solar farms, and other large projects on poor quality farmland without having local rezoning hearings or approvals. However, the Senate announced it would not advance that provision. It did pass in the House, but it died in the Senate, thank God. Folks, what I don't like about that, why is the Indiana Republican Party so down on farmers? Why are they so down on farmland? The quote was, to build a data center or solar farm on poor quality farmland.
What is the definition of poor quality farm ground?
I think by the Indiana Republican establishment, it is any farmland. They would always rather see a data center than a cornfield. They would always rather see a data center than a field with cattle in it. They would always rather see a data center than a beautiful wheat field.
The agricultural industry alone in Indiana.
Like, look at the tomatoes. The Indiana Republican Party establishment would rather see a data center in a place than a farm growing tomatoes. Indiana is a huge tomato grower, folks. A lot of people don't know that. For Red Gold, for instance, wonderful, delicious ketchup. I highly recommend it. You can buy it almost in any grocery store. Yep. Red Gold, made from Hoosier tomatoes. It is wonderful. That is not a paid promotion. I don't get anything from Red Gold. I just love their ketchup.
Raise popcorn, raise beans and corn.
Popcorn, corn, eggs. Obviously, my family, we sell eggs all over the world
pork.
From Indiana.
We raise chickens.
Indiana is a breadbasket for the world. And instead, the GOP establishment is just wanting to turn us into this war of the worlds alien spaceship where we have all these data centers trying to figure out how to eliminate our jobs while asking us to subsidize it.
So if you're producing on corn, you're producing less than 200 bushels to the acre. In Indiana, that's considered poor quality farm ground.
And back in the day, that was a lot. I remember when my dad started out farming, for a farmer to get 200 bushels was incredible.
Almost impossible. Now they're looking at 300 bushels.
Right.
As an average. Blackford County produced 365 bushel.
Folks, I'm telling you, as a farmer, there is no such thing as poor farmland. Every acre of poor farmland can be transformed into wonderfully productive farmland if it is farmed correctly.
Absolutely.
And so to just use that as an excuse to say, well, we don't want these farmers here, we want data centers here. No, Indiana's a farming state. I'm going to stand up for the farmer rather than the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, because I'm a farmer. And I live in the state of Indiana. I don't live in Virginia. Why are our elected political leaders wanting to not even live in the state, like Jim Banks? It's because they don't want to face the people that they are working to have their jobs eliminated. That's the sad reality.
It's the ultimate slap in the face.
And mentioning Mark Zuckerberg again and the deep state and these data centers and what they're going to be using this technology for, we touched on this briefly. It was talking about flock cameras. And this is from Wisconsin. This is from Jason Basler. A Menasha cop from Wisconsin recently used flock cameras 5 separate times to stalk his ex-wife. This is a predictable outcome of mass surveillance. Tools sold as safety quickly become tools of abuse. When the state builds a total surveillance apparatus, those with access will always abuse it. Again, that's from Jason Basler.
I think it goes to the old saying, if you give an inch, they take a mile.
Well, and it's picking winners and losers. That guy was obviously using it for a terrible reason to track his ex-wife. What I don't like is the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, in theory, doing the same thing by picking winners and losers. They are rewarding their political cronies with these massive no-bid contracts for tens of millions of dollars, all in exchange for a few campaign donation dollars. That happens over and over, and it's picking winners and losers. And again, I mentioned the lawn repair shop. It can be any type of business in the state of Indiana. It can be a farmer that has some chickens that's producing eggs. It could be a lawnmower repairman. It could be a restaurant. You're going to work. You're paying taxes. But the Indiana Economic Development Corporation is saying, well, these billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, they get to come in, never have to pay 92% of the taxes that you and I would have to pay if we were doing something similar, and saying that's a good thing, even though we're going to be paying for it through higher electricity prices and through our water being depleted. But again, folks, always follow the money. It's all about getting your property taxes up. This is from Indy Reporter again, highlighting a post by Angela Moore. Henry County, Indiana hikes property tax. Henry County Council adopted a permanent maximum levy increase, the highest amount of property tax revenue garnered each year. They are allegedly Republicans. Collecting more taxes than is absolutely necessary is legalized robbery. That's from Angela Moore. And what she's talking about is an article in the Courier-Times by John Tapley. The Henry County Council had its first meeting of 2026 on January 14th. The meeting continued with an important financial update from Baker Tilly Financial, who recommended Henry County adopt a permanent maximum levy increase, the highest amount of property tax revenue possible every year.
It's here. We have to deal with it. We have to be able to hold our elected officials accountable.
Well, and what I don't like talking about the community being left without is this 50-year exemption. I can maybe see 10 years for something, for a new business coming in that's going to add a lot of real jobs. But to give a 50-year exemption to these massive trillion-dollar corporations that will produce almost no jobs with no economic benefit to the state of Indiana, other than to politicians to raise your property taxes, there's no benefit to that. But they're getting a 50-year, 92% pass.
I mean, that's crazy. Think about it. 50 years. I mean, most of the people involved in this are probably going to be dead by that point. I mean, I don't mean to sound morbid here, but that's 50 years is a long time. I mean,
it's because a career politician only cares about their next election.
Exactly.
They don't care one whiff what the state of Indiana will look like in 50 years. Unfortunately, our elected leaders in the state of Indiana, you're right, Justin, they won't be here in 50 years. What will we be left with? We'll be left with a barren wasteland of nothing but data centers from Chicago to Louisville, from Terre Haute to Muncie. Is that the legacy we want to leave for our kids? A blighted state with no farmland and no jobs? So, folks, we are going to keep fighting this 100%. I have billboards all across the state of Indiana now saying no to data centers. Look on your Facebook for groups opposing data centers. They are popping up in nearly every county quickly now. Please join those, whether you're Republican or a Democrat. This is a Hoosier issue. It's not a partisan issue. We all together have to stand up to save our state from what these career politicians are doing to us, to say no to data centers.
We have to, raise the curtain, speak the truth, and shame the devil.
Absolutely.
26 counties have said no to data centers. They're putting a moratorium. And then 71 communities in 9 states have put on moratoriums on data centers.
Right. And Ron DeSantis is working tooth and nail to do the same thing. He's basically banned them in the state of Florida. We need to do the same thing here in Indiana. So, folks, we're out of time, but I want to close with my father's favorite Bible verse. Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. I will see you all again next week on the radio.